about preparation for winter hiking, how to make a plan, what to pack, how to perform once you're out there, how to make assessments and adjustments as you're moving, and then how to ponder when you're back home and think about your experience and try to learn from it. And then finally at the end, I'll have a slide that has lots of resources on it for you. There are many resources out there, and you already may have some that you like to use to plan your hikes, and that's great. So this is just a small example or small sampling of what's out there. So all about me. My current role is as a director of women's programs at Mooney Mountain Guides. Mooney Mountain Guides is a small guiding company that guides trips for rock climbing, ice climbing, mountaineering, backcountry skiing, and winter hiking. And we do that here in New Hampshire, as well as in the Pacific Northwest on the glaciated peaks of the Cascades. I also hold some American Mountain Guide Association certifications, single pitch instructor, which refers mostly to rock climbing, and apprentice alpine guide. But I wasn't always those things. This is a second career for me, and I came to it a bit later in life. Before that, and currently, I also have a career as a physical therapist, and I'm a wife, and I'm a mother of 2 grown children. But throughout all the years of my life, I have always been drawn to the mountains, much like all of you. I love the mountains, I love being in them, and they've always called to me. And so here's where I am now. I started off cutting my teeth like a lot of you here in the White Mountains, and it was my first experience in winter hiking was right here. And then I just grew that experience and expertise and took that then to greater peaks and greater ranges like the Cascades in Washington State, as well as the Alaska Range. I love winter hiking, and one of my favorite things about it is to hear the crunchy sound under my boots of cold snow. There are lots of things about winter hiking that are wonderful. And one of the things is beautiful scenery, as you can see in this picture, seeing snow-covered trees or having the sun glisten off glittery snow. It's absolutely spectacular and very different than what it looks like in the other months of the year. There are definitely less people and less crowds out there, and less bugs or no bugs. And anyone who has hiked in the Whites in May and June can appreciate that. The terrain in the winter can actually be friendlier to knees and hips and joints. When the snow gets packed down and you have a beautiful snow covering on the trail, all those pesky rocks and roots that the White Mountains are known for disappear, and you end up with a very gradual ramp of snow as a trail. There's usually no line at the summit sign on Mount Washington, so you can get your selfie without waiting in the cold snow. And there's some pretty cool gear that you need for the winter, and who doesn't love gear? So what's different about winter hiking? Obviously the weather. And the weather involves a few different factors. Temperature. It's cold. The average January high temperature on Mount Washington is 12 degrees Fahrenheit. That is cold. And it can range anywhere from 40 degrees to minus 20 or worse. And learning how to manage and maintain your body temperature in those conditions is crucial. Another weather factor that's important to consider is wind. In January, the summit of Mount Washington Observatory records hurricane force winds 1 out of every 3 days. That's a lot of wind. Wind can be an issue because if wind chill, it lowers temperature even more and creates risk of cold injury even greater. Wind can also affect visibility. As it churns, it can stir up the surface area snow and create whiteout conditions on the surface. That was the condition. If any of you were out there on Saturday and you looked up at the ridgeline of Mount Washington or the Presidential Range, it had this hazy look to it. That was stirred up snow. Wind can create real problems with visibility. It can also make it really hard to walk. Certain wind speeds, it becomes very difficult, and balance is an issue. Days are shorter in the winter, as you would expect, and we need to account for that. Everything gets harder in the dark. And also that wind can stir up snow. You can see in the picture on the slide too, you can just barely make out the cairns in the distance behind the hiker. Often you can't even see any of those cairns because the snow has covered them and the blowing snow makes it impossible to see. The other thing that's different about winter is the terrain. Obviously, snow is an issue. And if you are up in the mountains shortly after a big snowfall, you're going to encounter very deep snow. It takes a great deal more energy to navigate moving through snow. And your pace will also be significantly slowed down. On the other hand, anyone who's hiked in the White Mountains in the other seasons realizes that a lot of our trails follow stream beds and are very wet. Well, in the winter, those stream beds freeze into hard water ice. And that can create terrain that is very slippery and very difficult to maintain stability on and necessitates the need for traction, which we'll get into. So the terrain can be vastly different depending on the conditions, but all present differences from other seasons of hiking. And risk. Winter hiking carries greater risk. There is much less margin for error. Small issues can snowball into big problems with high consequences quickly. And it's important to recognize when that happens to try to prevent that snowball from going. Some of the factors that increase the risk in the winter, obviously weather, which we talked about, cold, wind, darkness, terrain. One of the things that's important to consider is if your hike is above tree line or below tree line. Trees provide some protection against wind. And so you can have a very different experience whether you're hiking above or below tree line. It's also important to recognize how search and rescue works in the White Mountains. Primarily, they are a volunteer organization who all have jobs doing other things during the day. And should you send out an SOS call, it's going to take some time for that manpower to be gathered and to get out to you. So you need to figure out how to take care of yourself in the conditions that you're in for that amount of time. So the risk is higher. It's important to recognize this. So how do we begin to manage these risks of winter hiking so we can go out and have a good day? Preparation. Preparation for a winter hike is huge. It takes some time and it begins long before you ever set foot on trail. Preparation is important for a couple of reasons. One is that the better planning that you do ahead of time, the more likely your trip is to come off without a hitch, be relatively risk-free, be enjoyable. The other reason is because it might prevent you from falling into what are known as heuristic traps. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that we use to make decisions. And in our day-to-day life, they're vastly helpful in preserving mental energy. We don't have to think about decisions. We just make them based on past experience and beliefs. When we are in new or dangerous situations, sometimes those heuristics, those mental those mental shortcuts can lead us to make decisions that don't take into account the current conditions and what's really happening around us, and can lead to decisions that are not in your best interest. Now, heuristics could be an entire presentation on that. And so I'm not going to go into that a lot. I will provide some resources at the end, but just being aware of what those are will help you begin to recognize them. One very brief example of that is the trap of scarcity. Let's say, you have one weekend this entire month that's free. That's the weekend you're going to the White Mountains. That's the weekend you've planned your trip and you're determined to do it because you have no other time. So you go and you forge on ahead with your trip, but you didn't take into account or didn't recognize that perhaps that weekend had conditions that made your choice of trip very risky. And you forged ahead and found yourself in conditions that you weren't prepared for. So that's just one example. So what I do before I go out on a trip, and what I encourage you to do, is to develop a pre-trip checklist that has lots of the homework that we're going to discuss on it. And that way you remind yourself to go through that checklist every time you plan a trip. The first thing on that checklist would be weather forecast. You want to know what conditions you're going to be hiking in. And the two sites that I like to use for my weather forecast for the White Mountains are the Mount Washington Observatory Higher Summits Forecast, MWOBS, and weather.gov, that's National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association. I find these two sites to be the most predictable and the most accurate for the White Mountains. Now, MWOBS does not put out their higher summits forecast until 48 hours prior to the day. And so you won't be able to lock in what your forecast is going to be until that time. However, what I encourage you to do is to follow the forecast of the area that you're going for a week or maybe even longer before you set out on your trip, because that forecast will start to give you information that will help you to predict what conditions you might encounter. Has there been a big snowstorm, so you're likely to encounter deep snow? Or perhaps there's been a rain event followed by a deep freeze, and you can anticipate finding very slick ice. So follow the weather forecast and then lock it in 48 hours before, and even check right up until the morning of your trip, because things do change and you want to know what you're walking into. The next thing on my checklist is a tour plan. To create a tour plan, where am I going and how am I getting there? The first part of that is to pick an appropriate objective. And what I mean by that is to pick a summit or a hike that is within your group's abilities and skills and is also consistently appropriate for the weather and the terrain that you're going to encounter. Start small. Build up your experience, build up your expertise on smaller, less consequential hikes. Your tour plan should include your route, what trails you're going to use. I like to also write down what my compass bearings will be, especially when I am going to be at a trail junction and turning. I want to know the basic direction I'm going to go in. Now, navigation is a big topic, and again, I'm not going to go deeply into that. I encourage you to know some navigation skills, but just know that that should be part of your tour plan. Especially in windy conditions, it's really hard to pull out that compass and pull out your paper map and see where you're going. But if you have a compass heading already written down or already in your head, then it makes life much easier in that moment. Your tour plan should also include a timeline. How long do I think it's going to take us to reach the summit or the ridge? And how long do I think it's going to take us to get back? And in addition to that, I like to set a turnaround time that will get me back to my car around dusk, because again, everything gets harder after dark. I also like to look at bailout options. And what I mean by that is, if I'm on a ridge line and the weather really deteriorates, how can I get to the cover of trees or below tree line where I have some cover from exposure? How do I get there the fastest? And knowing what a topographical map looks like, knowing what the information is telling you on that, is a super helpful skill to have. It will help you determine where your bailout points might be without getting yourself into deep drainages or perhaps near a cliff where it's too steep to navigate. As you go out, paper map and compass is one of those crucial things that you should have with you. The batteries don't die on paper maps. Should you like to do some apps, the two that I really like for determining making my tour plan is caltopo.com and GaiaGPS.com. And I do also have those on my phone, and I will use those on my phone, but it's not my only source of navigational information. Always have a backup. And there's lots of others out there, but they're fun to play with. You can do a tour plan on your laptop or on your computer and then transfer it to your phone and have your route there. There's some really neat things out there. The other thing I'm going to do is come up with a plan B and C. Again, because if I have a plan to maybe spend 6 hours on the presidential ridgeline and then my forecast tells me that there's going to be hurricane force winds, I need to have a different plan for the day. Also in my tour plan, when I'm when I'm forming it, I'm going to check trail conditions. And two of the sites that I really like to check that on are trailsnh.com and New England Trail Conditions. Here, people post trip reports of where they have been. And so you can see what someone has, in conditions someone has encountered on the trip that you're planning just a few days prior. There are some others as well. And those are two that I really like to use. All right. Next on my pre-trip checklist is gear selection. Now, the homework that I've done so far in terms of weather conditions and terrain and trip reports is helping me hone in on what gear I want to bring. So then I'm going to select my gear, and that will include layers and emergency gear and traction. I'm going to go into that in depth in just a minute. Communication. Leave your tour plan with a friend or family member, and also included that is a time when you are expected back. So should you be delayed, someone will know where you are, at least the vicinity, and be able to figure out how to get you some help. The other thing about communication is you need a reliable way to communicate when you are out on the trail. Cell phones are not really reliable. The batteries die in cold, they die very fast, and often there's not service where you are. So I recommend some kind of satellite communication device. Two that I use are an InReach and Spot. And both of those you can get out an SOS signal and get some help via satellite network and not relying on cell phone coverage. The other piece of communication that I find really important is to discuss the tour plan with your entire group that's going out with you that day. Make decisions together about where you're going to go, what your turnaround time is going to be, what you're all comfortable with. It is much easier to make these decisions and have these conversations in the warmth of your living room or even at the trailhead when you're rested and well fed and hydrated. Way easier than having them in the moment of crisis or conflict. So have those conversations before you ever leave the trailhead. Emergency response plan. Write it down. What will happen in the case of an emergency? What will our steps be? What will we need to take care of? Again, if you have that on a piece of paper in front of you, it's way easier to follow it than it is to come up with all those things when you are in crisis mode and there's an emergency. The emergency response plan should have information on it like who has a first aid kit? Where are these communication devices? How do we use those communication devices to send an SOS? I like to get emergency contact numbers from everyone in my group so that should something happen, I know who to call for them. I want to know where the nearest hospital is. I want to know where everyone's car keys are. Again, because if something happens, those are logistics you need to take care of. Leave no trace. This one is near and dear to my heart. We all love this resource of these mountains up here, and we need to take care of them, each and every one of us. And we need to be good models for that. You need to be prepared to pack out all of your trash and waste, and that includes human waste. It is completely impossible to dig a cat hole in frozen ground, and it's impractical to bury human waste in snow. So please bring a WAG bag, which is a container device that you can pack out human waste, or bring a Ziploc or whatever you prefer, but please pack out all waste and all garbage. That's part of your preparation. And then finally, build your skills and knowledge. Play with your gear in your backyard, play with it on small trails in your town that have no consequence to not being able to use the gear. Practice, and then start on lower peaks and slowly work your way up. Another way to build your skills is to take a course. Take a wilderness first aid course, wilderness first responder, take a navigation course, build your skills that way. You can go out with more experienced partners and friends. And finally, you could hire a guide. People might ask, why hire a guide for a hiking trip? Well, one reason is to help manage all of these risks that we're discussing. And the other reason is because the guide can do a whole lot of instruction during your day out with them so that you can make your way to becoming a more independent winter hiker. So that's preparation. There's a lot of it, and there should be. So now you've gathered all this information, and now it's time to pack and decide what you're going to wear. Clothing layers. Base layers, I really prefer wool or tech, and I often wear 2 or 3 base layers depending on the temperatures I'm anticipating. Wool and tech clothes, even if you sweat in them and they get moist, they will keep you warm, and that's important. Mid layer or a nice warm layer. In the middle of the screen, you'll see the blue and black. That's actually the Virgin Washington fleece. Super stretchy, warm, very comfortable. I actually wore that both days last weekend on Mount Washington. And if you recall, it was actually probably the coldest weekend we've had so far this season. And I found that layering piece to be incredibly warm and comfortable. I always bring a big warm puffy with an integrated hood. It's important for rest periods to lock in the body heat that I've been generating so I don't lose a lot. And it's also an important piece should something happen, someone gets injured, or I'm not able to move and generate my own heat, that's going to help keep me warm. On the bottom right is a wind layer. Especially above tree line, but pretty much any time in the winter, I want something that is going to prevent the wind from stealing all my body heat. So something that's impermeable. Gore-Tex or a heavy-duty rain layer might work. And finally, we need to protect the most vulnerable spots on our body, and that is face, hands, and feet. Nice warm wool hat. I like to have, to protect my face, especially above tree line and in wind, full ski goggles and a neoprene face mask. I find the neoprene face mask with a small holes cut for breathing to be the most protective and the least troublesome. They can cover your entire face. You don't want any skin showing when you're exposed to those winds because then you'll be at risk for cold injury of frost snip or frostbite. You could wear a buff. I see people doing that. But what happens with buffs often is that the moisture from your exhalation will freeze on the buff, and then you have a block of ice up against your face. It's uncomfortable and not safe. So I find the neoprene face mask to be the best. I will bring at least 2 pairs of gloves and a pair of warm mittens. Again, you're generating heat as you hike, especially uphill, and you're going to sweat a little bit. And if your gloves get wet, they no longer are good insulators of heat. So you want a couple pairs that you can switch out. And mittens are warmer than gloves. So I always throw in a pair of mittens. And I like chemical hand warmers. I think that they come in really handy. So I throw some of those in my pack as well. And feet, wool socks. And your boots. Your boots need to be winter season boots with insulation. The ones in the picture have about 400 grams of insulation. Typical 3-season leather hiking boots are really not going to cut it most days up in the White Mountains. You're at risk for cold feet. So I encourage you, if you're going to spend any time winter hiking, to get some insulated, appropriate winter boots. Some days I will even wear a double mountaineering boot that has 2 layers, one insulating layer and then a harder outside layer. And like, for example, last weekend on Mount Washington, those were days for double boots, winter mountaineering boots, to keep my toes warm. All right, food and fuel. You may have heard the saying that lunch starts as soon as breakfast ends and it goes until dinner starts. And that's true when you're hiking in the White Mountains in the winter. You need to continually fuel your engine. It's the only thing producing heat is your body, and it needs fuel. So eating regularly throughout your day on every rest stop is super helpful. Unfortunately, in winter, it is really not the time to spend a leisurely 45-minute lunch break on top of a summit enjoying the view. Some days you can do that, but a lot of days it's just too cold. So I would recommend that you have food that you can just continually eat at every rest break. I prefer foods that don't freeze into hockey pucks. So peanut butter and jelly, tortillas, dates, candy, any of that kind of stuff. I'm sure you all have your favorites. Just make sure that it provides good quick energy and it doesn't freeze. Often I keep my food in an interior jacket pocket as well to keep it warm. We don't usually feel thirst in the winter as much as we do in the summer, and that can be deceiving. because we still are losing a great deal of moisture, both through sweating as well as through our exhalations, our breath. And so it's important to continue to hydrate throughout your day. Dehydration can exacerbate hypothermia and other conditions, and it sneaks up on you. What I like to do for fluids is to take a wide mouth Nalgene bottle, like the one in the picture, and fill it with boiling water, some kind of an electrolyte powder, and some honey. Honey provides really quick energy. I boil that, I put it in the Nalgene, I put it in the insulation, and it stays warm through most of my day. If you don't have an insulation pack, you can use a wool sock. That works as well. I also like to bring a thermos of hot liquids. And if you properly prime a thermos, meaning fill it with boiling water, let it sit for 5 minutes, dump that out, and then put your hot liquid in, your hot chocolate, your tea, your coffee, it will stay warm the whole day. And I always bring a warm thermos of warm liquids. In winter day hikes in the Whites, I will bring that thermos in lieu of bringing a stove and fuel. And the reasons for that are that it can take a really long time to melt snow into drinking water. And that's a long time that you're sitting there waiting for that to happen. And if you're in windy conditions, it can be extremely difficult to keep a stove lit. So in lieu of bringing a stove, what my preference is to just bring that thermos of hot liquids. It's ready. I can give it to someone who's suffering really from feeling cold right away, and it stays warm all day. I don't recommend Camelbacks. The hoses, if there's any liquids left in that, it will often freeze and then shut off your water supply for the day and you're out of luck. So those aren't really recommended. And finally, another strategy that I use to stay well hydrated, all seasons actually, is I prepare, just like I did my other preparation the day before. I try to drink a lot of fluids the day before. And then I will drink about 1 liter of water on my way to the trailhead on the car ride. And that way I know I'm starting my day well hydrated and in good condition. Yes.
We have a real quick question.
Sure.
From a participant. Could you please address what types of foods you like to have? You talked about honey, it's quick calories, but how do you think about being out in the winter on a hike, knowing you're eating a lot of calories versus something quick hitting, types of foods, things like that?
That's a great question.
You might just want to repeat it.
So the question was about what types of food do I recommend to be that quick energy, especially for a winter hike. There's lots of research on this, and I'm not a nutritionist and not an expert, but what I find is that carbohydrates are what we burn first, and what's in our blood system is what we go through first. And then after carbohydrates, we will start to burn fats and then finally protein. But it takes a while to get that protein accessible to us. So the foods that I prefer to have on a winter hike to provide ready energy are those carbohydrates. Things like breads, bagel, dates. Dates are full of carbohydrates and glucose. And there are lots of bars that are made out of dates, if you don't want to bring just plain dates. Honey, as I mentioned before, can be a great source of quick energy. Sugars are a great source of carbohydrates and quick energy. The typical trail mix, which has a lot of nuts in it, it can actually take a while for you to digest that and for that to become readily available energy. So while that might be part of what you bring, you want to make sure you bring some ready carbohydrates as well. So yeah, cookies, brownies, I mean, all the stuff that, are considered treats, they're actually really good trail food for you. Hopefully that answered the question, but if you have more, just let me know. Okay, traction. So again, I've already gathered a lot of information that helps me anticipate what kind of trail conditions I'm going to encounter. But often I'm ending up bringing 2 different kinds of traction, possibly 3, because I might encounter several different kinds of terrain issues. One of the traction options are mountaineering snowshoes. And if you look in the picture here, you can see that the side rail of these mountaineering snowshoes have teeth along the whole edge. They will give me traction and bite and security as I'm going up and down steep hills. Tubular snowshoes do not have those teeth on the sides. They only have the teeth under the toes. And I find that for a lot of the steep trails in the whites, those tubular snowshoes don't give me as much traction as I want. I will choose snowshoes as well, especially if I know that there's some deep snow up there, or I think there's been a lot of drifting and I'm likely to encounter heavy, deep snow. Microspikes, they're light, they're small, they provide pretty good traction on stiff snow and some soft ice, and those tend to live in my pack from fall through spring. I always have them in there in case I should encounter some of those conditions anywhere. Sometimes microspikes are not enough. On that really hard water ice or on really wind-blown, slick snow slopes, that's hard to say, microspikes do not really give me enough traction to feel secure, especially if I'm on a steep hill where there's a long run out. What I mean by that is if I were to fall, I'd slide a long way. For that kind of condition, I want full-on mountaineering crampons. Those have 10 or 12 points, and they're much bigger points than on a microspike, and they can provide the kind of security that you need for hard water ice or those hard packed snow slopes with heavy runouts. Different crampons have different ways of attaching to your boots. So if you're going to get crampons, which I recommend, make sure they're compatible with the boot that you have. And finally, trekking poles. I think that those are super helpful for lots of reasons. I know people are kind of pro or not, but I think that they're great to have in the winter. They're super helpful if you're trudging through heavy snow. They're also really helpful in super windy conditions at just giving you another base of support so that you don't tumble and fall in heavy winds. And again, I might have 2 or 3 of these options in my pack on any given day based on what I think I might encounter. And that brings up the point too, where often I might bring mountaineering crampons, which I don't really need down low where there's heavier snow packed down or it's not so slippery. But I'm really going to want them on those certain points where it's slick water ice. And so bring the tool that you need for the job and for the scariest, most consequential job. Yes.
Quick question on crampons.
Yes.
It might be a little specific. It was about, you had some prior photo, I believe.
Yes.
He was asking
yes.
Crampons you use with those.
Yes. Okay. So crampons with the oboes boots or boots that do not have a rigid plastic sole with a rigid heel and toe, welt we call them, which is sort of like a ridge. So regular winter boots that don't have that, you need basketing crampons. So on the front and the back of the crampon, they simply have sort of brackets that then are attached by straps. And they have a little bit more flexibility built in, but you're looking for a crampon with a basket attachment. If you have the rigid mountaineering boots, then you're looking for what's called an automatic crampon, which has a toe bar, a metal bar, and also a heel clip. And those are called automatic. So hopefully that will help. Again, I can answer more questions about that and even provide, if someone shoot me an email and I'll send you some examples if that would be helpful. All right, emergency gear. This is part of packing. Again, as I mentioned, the issue is search and rescue. You need to be prepared to take care of yourself and keep yourself alive for what could be several hours or perhaps even overnight in the conditions that you're in that wind, in the cold. And so you need some specific emergency gear for winter. First aid kit, that's all the time, especially for winter as well. And that's going to have in it Band-Aids, perhaps any medications I need. It's going to have maybe a splint, a sling, those kinds of things. Satellite communication device, you'll see a spot and also an inReach there. One or the other, both of them will get out SOS signals. One of the big differences is that with the inReach, you can actually text through that device, through a satellite network, and communicate with people on your contact list or with the authorities who might be coming to get you. And that can be helpful because you can really communicate exactly what the problem is and what you need. But if you don't have that, you can get the spot, and that just signals an SOS, and they can figure out where you are and come and find you. Both of those require a subscription in addition to the initial cost of purchasing the device. A headlamp, that's in my pack all the time. If you get delayed, or if someone is injured and immobile and can't move and darkness falls, everything gets much harder. So having a headlamp with some fresh batteries is an important part of your gear. A sleeping bag. If I'm immobile and I can't generate heat by moving, then I need something to insulate me, and a sleeping bag will do that. A foam pad can be super helpful at helping you retain your body heat. It gets you up off the snow or up off a cold rock, so you don't lose more body heat to that surface. And that's pretty lightweight. And then finally, in the orange stuff sack in the bottom of the picture is an emergency shelter. That one is a 4-person shelter that works kind of like a parachute, the games that you played in elementary school where you flip it over your head and everyone sits on a corner. It doesn't insulate, but what it does is provide protection against the wind, and that will help you retain some body heat and keep you warmer and protected for some time that you have to be out there. It's lightweight, it's small, easy to throw in the pack, and can really make a difference, especially if you're above tree line or in the wind. You can divide this emergency gear up amongst all the members of your group, so not one person is tasked with carrying all of it. But important to know that you have all these pieces, possibly some more, and important to know who's got what. Yep, another question. Yes.
If you could repeat the questions.
Yes.
So one is they asked the name of the emergency, the parachute type thing. So what's the name or the brand of that?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yep. So the brand of that emergency 4-person shelter is RAB, R-A-B, and it's a RAB 4-person shelter. I believe it also comes in a 2-person shelter and maybe even a 6-person shelter. But the brand name is RAB, R-A-B.
Okay. And another question is, person asked about how much does your pack weigh when you go out for a day, for like a day trip?
Yeah.
You know?
That's a good question. The question was, how much does my winter pack weigh when I go out for a day trip? Oof, that's a good question. And I would say with 1 liter to 2 liters of water, if I'm carrying all the emergency gear, strapped on snowshoes, possibly crampons, it's probably 35 pounds, give or take. Winter gear weighs more. You need more. Your pack is bigger, and you need to bring that with you. Again, you can split up some of that with your teammates and hopefully lighten your load a little bit.
Question related to packing: what size pack is it? You know, like how many liters?
Yes,
like that?
my winter pack is a 45-liter pack. And part of that is because, you know, all this stuff takes up space. Sleeping bags take up space, but I use a 45-liter pack. I think you could maybe get away with a 35-liter, but 45-liter seems to be the sweet spot for me. All right. Great questions. Thank you. Okay, so you've prepared and you've packed, and now it's time to go out and hike. Finally, we got here. All right, so while you're hiking, though, the work isn't done. You're obviously doing lots of physical work. You're going uphill in the cold, in the snow, in the mountains, but that's why we do this, because we love it. Things that you need to really take care of while you're out there. Body temperature regulation. That is crucial. And that's something I hear a lot of people struggle with. I hear people say, oh, I sweat too much, or I get really cold as soon as I stop. And that is true. While you're moving, you're generating heat and you're releasing that heat. And as soon as you stop, you're not. And so that cold temperature and the wind will come in and start stealing your body heat. So maintaining that, regulating that is a skill that takes some time to develop, but it's crucial. Three things that you can do to help regulate your body temperature. One is your layers. So obviously if you're going up and you're getting warm, take off layers. You do not want to sweat through all of your layers. You preferably don't want to sweat much at all. It's not unusual for me to be down to one long sleeve shirt while I'm hiking, even in 20-degree weather, if I'm going up a steep slope. And that's fine. As long as I'm generating that heat, I'm fine. As soon as I stop, I need to put more layers on. You can take off your hat, take off your gloves, zip or unzip your jackets. All of those ways, all of those things are ways for you to regulate your body temperature, with the goal being that you're not sweating profusely and wetting through all of your clothes. Also, as soon as you do stop and rest, throw on that puffy jacket, throw on your hat and your mittens. Keep the body heat that you're generating in, because when you stop, you will start to lose it. So keep that in. And that leads me to the next thing with body temperature regulation is food. Talked a little bit about that. The only thing generating heat is your body, and it needs fuel. So you need to continually fuel it with food. And the third thing that you can use to regulate your body temperature is your pace. And this can be tricky because you have a timeline. You want to make the summit at a certain time. You want to go at a certain pace. But you need to also maintain your body temperature. So if you're sweating profusely, slow down. If you're getting cold, speed up. Use your pace to regulate your body temperature. So those three things, layers, food, and pacing, can go a long way towards regulating that body temperature.
Lori, a question related to that, in terms of food consumption,
Mm-hmm.
do you regularly stop, say, every half hour for a fuel and food break?
Yes.
Or how do you kind of gauge some of that?
Yes.
Kind of
so the question was, how and when do I eat? How do I manage taking in that food? And what I do is I stop about every 45 minutes to an hour. And at that time I drink and I eat and I take care of any other needs that need to be met. So I'm taking in calories about every hour. Now, this is something that's pretty personal to each person. And so what I really encourage you to do, again, is to go out and practice on less consequential terrain or less consequential mountains and see how it goes. That way, if you find that you are underfed and you get cold and hungry, you're not, above tree line and you have 6 hours in the car. So play with it with your own body. Everyone's metabolism is different based on a myriad of factors. So I can tell you what works for me, but I really encourage you to experiment with that. I eat about every 45 minutes to an hour, and I don't eat a ton because that can be uncomfortable as well, but I take in a significant amount. That leads me to the next point, which is to anticipate your needs. So food and hunger, we just talked about that, but also getting cold. As soon as I stop, I am going to put that puffy jacket on, because it is much easier to stay warm than it is to get warm again after I've gotten chilled. And one thing I notice is that when people start to get really cold, it increases anxiety and it increases mental discomfort. And then you begin to act in ways that might not be in your best interest. You're rushing, you're hurrying, you're taking off on the trail at a really fast clip because you're cold and anxious. So try to avert that by maintaining that body heat with your puffy when you stop. Also, think about, if I'm about to emerge out of tree line up on a ridge where I'm going to be fully exposed to the wind, I want to prepare for that before I'm in that wind. So I'm going to stop short of emerging from tree line, and I'm going to get ready my goggles, my face mask, my wind jacket. I'm going to get all that ready and put it on so that when I emerge into that wind, I am protected already. It is not the time to start pulling your pack apart when you're in 60-mile-an-hour winds. You're going to lose things, and it's much harder, and you're going to get cold really fast. So anticipate needs. Pacing. As you're hiking, it's important to think about your pacing. We already talked about it in the context of maintaining body temperature, but also your timeline. Are we on target for our summit or our goal? Or are we too fast or too slow? Do we need to adjust our pace? Can we adjust our pace? Are we redlining and going way too fast and we're just not going at the pace we thought we might? So then you need to make adjustments in your goal for the day and what you plan to do. Keep an eye on weather conditions. You've done all your homework, so you anticipate what the forecast is going to be, but is that what you're finding? Is it way windier? Is it much colder? Has that precipitation, that snow, come in 3 hours earlier than you thought it would? Pay attention to those weather conditions and make adjustments to get yourself to a safe place before you run into trouble. Terrain. We've done that homework. We've looked at the trip reports. Are we encountering what we thought we would? Is this way icier than we anticipated and I didn't bring my crampons? If that's the case, you need to make adjustments, and preferably before you find yourself in a situation that could lead to injury. With terrain also, I want to continually ask myself, can I go down what I just came up? Often going up very steep and icy slopes is easier than going down. And it's important to continually kind of look back, assess that terrain, and make sure that you are comfortable getting back down what you've just gone up, and vice versa. Look at that before you go up. In the same respect, if you are heading up to a summit and losing track of time, you have to ask yourself, can I get back down to tree line or back down to my car in a timely manner? And finally, your group. Check in with your group members throughout your hike. How's everyone doing? And this is another place that you can fall into one of those heuristic traps. We all want to be liked. None of us wants to be the person who says, I can't go to the summit, I'm too tired. But it's really important to share that information and to create a culture within your hiking group where it's okay to say that. Much better to say that and to make an adjustment in your plan before you get into a situation where the consequences are much higher. So continually check on your group, ask how people are doing, and make adjustments. All right, you've gone on your hike. It's been great. You're back at the car. Maybe you're, in post-COVID times, hopefully, or at the bar, or at the restaurant, or even back in your living room. Our tendency is to just go throw all our gear back in the closet and get on with our week, go back to work, whatever you're doing. But I encourage you to stop, whether it's at the car with your group, whether it's in the restaurant or around the fire pit afterwards, or the following week, follow up by email. Talk with your group or even just by yourself and think about your trip. How did it go? What did I learn? Did things go as planned? Did I have the right gear? Did my gear work? Did I know how to use my gear? Ask yourself those questions and see it as an opportunity to learn. I also think it's important to think about any close calls. Did someone almost slip at a place where they could have fallen a long way, but they didn't? And what would we do differently next time to make sure that that risk didn't present itself or that we managed it differently? Were we lucky or did we make good decisions? Sometimes that's hard to tell, but it's important to ask that question. That's how you're going to learn. That's how you're going to become a more experienced and a more competent winter hiker. So I encourage you to take time to do a good, solid debrief. And it can be really helpful to do that with other people because obviously everyone has their own perception of how the day went. And it's really helpful to hear those different ideas. So, takeaways, winter hiking. These are the main areas of things that you need to do to ensure that you have a good experience. Prepare, that takes some time. It's in depth, it's important. Plan, make that tour plan. Make an emergency response plan. Figure out exactly what you want to do that day. Pack the right gear. Pack it well, bring everything you need and even more so. Often in winter, I don't use a lot of what's in my pack because it's there for an emergency. So that's a good thing if I didn't use it. And then perform. When you're out on that hike, stay vigilant, stay self-aware, and make adjustments as needed. And then at the end, when you get home, ponder. debrief, think about what you learned, and then the next time you go out, you'll be that much more competent and have even a better experience. Resources. So maybe we can leave this up as we go through the question and answer. And again, there's a lot of resources. These are just a few of the many that are out there, and ones that I find helpful. Again, for weather, I like the Mount Washington Observatory and NOAA as my sources. Trail conditions, Trails NH, NewEnglandTrailConditions.com. The Hike Safe Card, let's talk about that. The Hike Safe Card, many of you may be aware of this, is something that's provided by New Hampshire Fish and Game. You purchase it. All of the proceeds for this card go to supporting search and rescue teams. And that's a really important thing for us to have in these mountains. When you go to purchase your Hike Safe Card too, there are some educational opportunities that will help you be an even more informed hiker when you go out there. So I encourage you all to buy that Hike Safe Card, support search and rescue, and become a more knowledgeable hiker. Navigation apps, again, many out there. I like Gaia GPS, CalTopo, and Avenza Maps. They have, and for those of you who are really tech savvy, you can go into deep, awesome holes with these apps about building trip plans and looking at terrain, and they're pretty amazing. Tech clothing layers, Virgin Outdoor here makes some great layers. As I said, I wore the Washington fleece layer both days on Mount Washington last weekend, which was really cold, and I found it to be super amazingly warm and comfortable. I have 2 articles on heuristic traps and decision-making in wilderness settings. These are, a lot of this kind of information is applied to avalanche issues and avalanche accidents, but they are applicable not even just to wilderness settings and hiking, but to a lot of our behavior in any setting. So these are just 2 articles to make you more aware of that. And again, if you're more aware, you're more likely to recognize when it's happening and avoid falling into those traps. And then a guide service. If you would like to hire a guide to help manage some of these risks and also to do even more education one-on-one when you're out there, you can give us a shout at info@Mooney Mountain Guides. Also, if you have more questions about this presentation, you're very welcome to contact me there. Just shoot me an email and I'm happy to answer any questions. And then I just threw up my Instagram handle, so you can also contact me there. So thank you all so much for listening. I'm happy to answer any and all questions. And I'm just really grateful you were here tonight, and hopefully you got some good information to help.
All right, Lori, hopefully we don't get any feedback here. Couple of questions from the Q&A. First of all, do you always bring a sleeping bag above tree line?
Yes, always. Now, that sleeping bag is like, I think it's a 20-degree bag, right? And often the temperatures up there are way worse than 20 degrees. I'm not going to be comfortable, but I'm going to survive in that bag. So yes, I always bring a sleeping bag.
All right, next up. What would you recommend as a base layer for someone who sweats all the time? And do you ever change your base layers during a hike?
So first I would recommend wool. Wool will keep you warm even when it's soaking wet. So I really recommend wool. And yes, I do recommend for people who sweat a lot, yes, bring an extra base layer. Be strategic about where you change that out in 2 ways. One, don't change it out too soon. So if you're not done expending a lot of energy going uphill, wait. Change it out perhaps at the top when you start heading down. And 2, be strategic, get out of the wind, get protected, have your teammates form, a wall of bodies around you so that when you're down to your skin, you're not exposed to the full wind. So yes, I highly recommend that. You will find you are instantly warmer if you put on a dry base layer.
I have a question here from a member, a participant, specifically asking about pit stops and using them in harsh conditions, especially for women. Do you have any, I guess, insights or secrets there that you can share?
Yes, first of all, don't hold it. Go. It takes a lot of energy actually to hold it. So try not to hold it. There are, even up on the ridges, there are certain strategic spots that I've found where I can get out of the wind behind a rock to protect myself from the wind. Yes, it's cold, but if you can get out of the wind, it's going to make a big difference. Second of all, I'm not shy about just asking the other members of my group to turn around so I don't have to go deep into the woods, into thigh deep snow. I just will pull off where I can and ask them to turn around. That's a very legitimate request and people should respect that. There are for women pee funnels, which take some practice. Please, that's another part of your preparation is practice at home because it can take some practice, but that will allow you to take care of going to the bathroom without exposing your entire body. So there's a bunch of different ones out there on the market and you'll just have to experiment to find the one that works best with you, for you.
Thank you. Do you know if the fishing license still covers Hike Safe?
You know what? There was just a big discussion about that online, and I do not know the answer. I'm sorry. I think it does, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So if you have your fishing license, maybe check on that.
Okay, great. No worries there. People are asking for an example of a warm enough puffy.
Oh, well, the one that I have is an outdoor research puffy that I believe has 800 grams of down insulation. I think 600 to 800 grams is where you want it to be. So there are thinner puffies, and if you look at a lineup in a store, you can tell a thinner puffy from a really big puffy. Yes, they're more expensive. And they are a little less compact, but they are really important for hiking, especially above tree line or in really cold temperatures in the whites. If you don't have a super big one, then you can layer several other puffies. And sometimes I will do that. I will bring a lighter puffy and a heavy puffy on the coldest days of the year. So yeah, I mean, without going too far down the gear rabbit hole, you know, any kind of outdoor brand that's making significant puffies, and they will often market that as higher summit or higher altitude puffies. That's what I would look for.
Also, how do you assess snow conditions and avalanche danger, specifically above tree line on Mount Washington?
Ooh, great question. We could do an hour on that. So another resource that's not on here is the Mount Washington Avalanche Center. I encourage you to follow them. You can subscribe to their avalanche bulletins, which they put out every morning during the season in the about 7 a.m., 8 a.m. I'm going to give you some generalizations, but nothing will substitute for taking an avalanche course. And actually, both Mount Washington Avalanche Center and other places do a lot of online. I think Mount Washington Avalanche Center does almost weekly talks free online if you subscribe to, you know, if you follow them, that you can gain a lot of information without taking a formal avalanche course. But if you, on Mount Washington, we are lucky in some respects in that with a wind direction that is pretty predictably from the north and the northwest, what happens is that it loads the snow, blows it across the ridges, and it loads it on east-facing slopes. This is a generalization from a northwest wind. And so on those east-facing slopes is where you're going to encounter more avalanche danger. Up on the ridge lines in the White Mountains, Franconia Ridge and the Presidential Range, it tends to be pretty wind scoured. And in general, the avalanche danger up there is small along the ridge line. You can have small pockets of drifting snow that can be an issue, but they're generally not big. And again, these are gross generalizations, and I wouldn't want you to walk away thinking that this would give you enough information to assess avalanche danger. So please follow the Mount Washington Avalanche Center. They also are, you know, Mount Washington and Tuckerman's Ravine, Huntington's Ravine, Gulf of Slides, they are very unique kind of areas compared to the rest of the country. And the guys guys and gals who do the avalanche forecasting for these areas are incredibly good at it and knowledgeable. So I would start there.
All right, another gear question for you, Lori. Do you have a recommendation for winter hiking boots?
For women, I don't know if they make a men's, but I love Obo, O-B-O-E. I think they make great, really comfortable boots. Morel makes some really nice winter hiking boots. Anything that's got some decent insulation. Oh, Vask also makes some really good ones. Yeah, and those are basic hiking boots. Those are not mountaineering boots. They don't have the rigid sole, so they're a little more comfortable. You can put on microspikes, snowshoes, and you can put on a semi-automatic crampon.
Next up, do you have any suggestions for books or other resources that can kind of help educate people on determining and understanding bad situations in the mountains, different courses of action they might take, things like that?
So you all might be familiar with a local author, Ty Gagne. Ty has written 2 books on incidents in the White Mountains. One is called Where You'll Find Me. The other one is called The Last Traverse. Both of these take place right here on terrain that you might even be familiar with. And Ty does a fabulous job of talking about the decision making that happens in these 2 incidents, the higher stick traps that people fall into, and unfortunately in these 2 incidences, the fatal consequences of those decisions. And he does so in a way that is incredibly insightful and not judgmental. And I think that's really important to understand, is that we all fall into these traps in occasion. And it's really easy to afterwards to, Monday morning quarterback it. But I think Ty does a fantastic job. So I really recommend his books. Yeah, I think I'd stop there with those 2.
All right. Have you ever run into a bear or a moose on the trail? And
Yes.
what did you do?
Yes, both. Not at the same time, though. So my encounters with bears and the whites have been, I surprised the bear. The bear was very surprised by me and very skittish and ran off before it was an issue. It wasn't something where we were very close or face to face. Typically, I find that the bears in this area are pretty skittish of humans unless they've been habitualized, meaning they've tasted human food and they're hanging out at a campsite. That's a different story. But in general, anytime I've encountered a bear, they have run away faster than I can really even see them. And if you're in a group and you're talking and you're making noise, that bear is going to hear you and smell you long before you get there. And so for the most part, they're going to run away. I know some people have had encounters that didn't go that way, but that's been my experience. And moose, ran into a moose on Moosilauke because, right, there should be a moose on Moosilauke. And again, she maybe just kind of looked at me and kept on chewing leaves and was not concerned at all. Now, I think that in enclosed terrain, moose are going to go down the path. And if you're standing there, they're going to go right through you, is my understanding. So getting out of their way, giving them a wide berth, whether it's moose or bear, is the best thing that you can do. And again, making any kind of noise. If I'm hiking alone and, the hair stands up on the back of my neck and I think maybe there's something in the woods, I'll just start talking out loud. I'll bang my poles together. I'll whistle. I'll just make some noise. And I think that that's a good strategy for here.
Do you have any thoughts on taking dogs on winter hikes? A lot of them obviously do it in the summer. Is winter too dangerous? How do you think about that?
That's a great question. And, I thought about that because this weekend on Mount Washington, I saw 4 dogs and I thought about that question a lot. I do not have a dog. I'm not a dog owner. And I think that it's really hard to generalize because some dogs and some breeds thrive in winter conditions and others really suffer. So I think it's about knowing your dog. And again, just like I asked you to think about starting small and working your way up to more consequential terrain, I would recommend doing that with your animal. So start on small winter hikes around your neighborhood, through the woods in your town, and then maybe start with some small mountains where you're only out for a short amount of time, see how your dog responds, and slowly build up. I would think that on just like humans, there's a certain threshold where an animal is going to be just as uncomfortable as you are and is going to need some gear, just like you are, whether that's a jacket or the boots to protect their paws. But I think it's hard to generalize that, and you need to know your animal and be just as aware of your animal's needs and concerns as you would be a teammate of a human hiking teammate.
Another gear question. What do you suggest for pants? Do you have any suggestions for pants?
Yes. And again, I recognize that this doesn't come cheap. And so I can give you sort of different options for that. So what I wear on my legs when I am out in cold days in the winter is I wear a wool base layer, I wear a fleece base layer, and then I wear typically a soft shell pant. Soft shell is a stretchy material that has some insulation, and it also has a DWR finish, meaning it will repel some moisture. It's not waterproof. It's not a shell or a rain pant, but it will repel some light moisture. Lots of people make soft shell pants. In really windy conditions, I will wear Gore-Tex hard shell pants, again, because I don't want that wind to rob me of my body heat. And so all of that comes at a price tag, I recognize. So a great wind protection layer that can do a lot in most conditions is a good rain pant. It blocks out all moisture. It's impermeable to moisture, so it's going to keep out a lot of the wind, and that can come a little bit cheaper than a hard shell Gore-Tex pant. The other thing I would recommend is consignment shops, and certain manufacturers like Arc'teryx and Patagonia have used gear sites, and you can get some really great gear at much discounted prices.
Regarding crampons,
Yeah.
again, so another gear question here. Many products or sites recommend rigid boot sole, even with crampons that just strap on. In your experience, do you find that to be true? This person's not a mountaineering. They just want to hike some 4,000 footers. I mean, how far up the scale, obviously conditions and things like that are going to make a difference, but how far up the scale do you think you really need to go?
If you have no intention of doing serious winter mountaineering or ice climbing or glaciers, if you just want to hike in the winter, then I think you can stick with a good winter boot. And then I believe that it is Hills Hound makes a trail crampon. So they have several different levels of traction. And I believe that their most aggressive, meaning their biggest crampons, will fit and stay on a flexible boot sole pretty well. I don't personally have those, but I have a couple of people that I've hiked with who do, and those seem to work really well. So that's Hills Hound. And I can't remember the exact brand, the exact model number, but if you look on their website, you'll see the progression of aggressiveness. And so the most aggressive one is the one I would go for that.
Thank you.
Anybody who is interested in serious mountaineering or ice climbing, getting a rigid boot is a great investment because you'll use it for all those things. And then you can get the automatic crampons.
Here's a question from a participant. I've heard of people using small sleds or similar things on descents. Are they a good idea?
I think you should ask your mom that question. It's really hard to stay in control on a sled. There are lots of trees and rocks. And here's what I'll say about that. That's a personal preference. It can be really fun. it's a little riskier. What I will say is if you're going to use a sled, take off your micro spikes and crampons before you sit on that sled. Because if your feet are out front and you just catch a spike, you could easily break your leg. So I'm not going to comment on whether you should or shouldn't do that. What I will say is if you're going to do it, take off your spikes and be careful.
Okay, thank you. Most weather conditions, I believe this is in reference to the Mount Washington Observatory, are based off the summit. For example, Sunday it was reporting this degree, the mountain forecast, the Jackson forecast. So, how do you kind of gauge the difference between Mount Washington, the valley, and then, like Tom Field and Willie? You know what I mean? Where you're trying to look, if you're not headed up there, but you're down here, you're 2,000 feet lower. How do you kind of think about that?
Right. So a couple of good things that you can do. If you go on the Mount Washington Observatory, I believe it's the current summit conditions, you can see the auto road profile. And what that does is give you temperatures at different elevations. So that's one source of information that you can get. And you can kind of see what the pattern is. Sometimes there's even going to be an inversion where it's colder below in the valley than it is up on the summit. That tends to happen more in the shoulder seasons, but that's one way that you can figure it out. The other sort of rule of thumb is that for every 1,000 feet you go up in elevation, you tend to fall about 3 degrees in temperature. So that's another way that you can estimate it. You could do the weather.gov, you could plug in the ground area where you're going to start, and then you could look at MWOBs, and then you have those two sort of extremes, and you can kind of extrapolate then where you're going to be. In terms of wind, that can really be an above or below tree line issue. So if you're going to be on a hike, for instance, Pierce, where you are in the trees, almost to the top, to the summit, then wind is less of an issue. You can also look at wind direction. If the wind is coming from the north or the northwest, and I'm hiking on the southern exposure of a hill, I'm going to be protected from the wind. So while you can't get an exact point forecast, perhaps for the peak that you're doing, you can take all of that information and gather a picture of what you're likely to encounter.
All right, thank you. Just a general note to the participants out there. Oh, okay, I was gonna say we have 2 questions left. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A because we're gonna try and wrap this up in about the next 10 or 12 minutes. Question here, Lori. How do you assess when you need micro spikes versus your more rugged traction crampon type devices? How do you kind of make that change in your head or, make a switch on your boot?
That's a good question. In general, it has to do with the terrain and 2 things of the terrain. Well, 3 things. Micro spikes are fine for stiff snow, soft, wet ice, and low angle ice, meaning it's not super steep, and in protected areas. So what I think about is I look at the terrain that I'm on, and are my spikes enough to bite into that surface and give me control? And I also look at what's going to happen if they don't. If I fall, where am I going to slide? Am I going to slide 2 feet into a snow pile? Or am I going to slide 30 or 40 feet to the edge of a steep incline into the Ammonoosuc stream? So I look at the consequence of if my traction doesn't hold. And I think about that, and I decide then if I want to go to a more aggressive boot. Now, once you start hiking these trails, you are also going to be able to think, to kind of anticipate. For instance, on the Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail, I almost always bring full-on mountaineering crampons because there's enough ice and water and steep areas on that trail that I know I'm going to want them. On lower angle, more gradual hikes and trails, and if there's good snow cover, I can anticipate probably micro spikes. So I know that's a kind of a vague answer, but the terrain can change dramatically. There's also, there's a point on the trail up to Mount Washington from Lake of the Clouds Hut up into the summit where you're just coming across a snowfield and you're going sideways across. So it's not real steep. However, that area can get very wind scoured and bullet hard snow. And the fall, if you should fall there, you're going to slide a couple 100 feet into the trees. The consequence is huge there. So is it hard walking? No. But the consequence is such that I can't afford an even minor slip. So I'm going to want my full crampons there. So think about those kinds of questions when you make that decision.
Thank you, Lori. Are you familiar with the website mountainforecast.com? It gives, and you find it as valuable as some of the other sites you mentioned?
I find that to be extremely valuable when I'm out west in Washington State. I don't find it as accurate for the Presidential Range and the Franconia Ridge as MWOBS and weather.gov. I find that they tend to be on the low end of predicting. So for example, the wind speeds that they predict tend to be lower than MWOBS is predicting. And the temperatures may be a little bit more moderate. So I think that that is a fantastic site for certain regions of the country. I think it gives you some information for here, but I find MWOBS and weather.gov to be more accurate.
Thank you. Which 4,000 footer would you recommend for starting your winter hiking?
That's a fantastic.
Or maybe you have more than one, but some that you would recommend.
So that's a fantastic question. Criteria I would use are 4,000 footers that don't have a lot of exposure, don't have a lot of steep areas, and are well traveled. So things like Tecumseh is a great one. Pierce is a good one. I think that Tom Field and Willie can be pretty good for that. They have some steep sections near the top, but in general, they're well protected. So those five are great ones to start with. And there's more. There are people with even more experience in the whites, plenty more experience than I do. So, but those are just ones that would be good starts.
Thank you. Snowshoes. Do you carry them every time? And what do you recommend? So first, that's two questions. So one, do you carry snowshoes with you every time? And then number two, if you haven't snowshoed before, what's a good way to learn how to use them?
Mm-hmm. Great. If you haven't snowshoed before, pick up a pair, head out in your yard, start there, figure out how the bindings work, figure out how your gait changes, your gait meaning how you're walking. You tend to have to walk with your feet slightly farther apart and pick your feet up a little bit higher. So start in your backyard, then go on flat trails near your house, then try even a hill in your yard or a snowbank at a mall. Put them on and just try them on different terrain, going up, going down, figure out how your balance has to be. And then start on smaller mountains and go from there. Do I carry them every time? I don't. And some people will have an argument with that. If I am on an extremely well packed out trail that is firm and doesn't have fresh snow on it, and I'm not sinking in, and I know I'm going to need crampons later, I'm going to choose to not carry the weight of the snowshoes and bring those crampons. If I think I'm going to encounter deep snow of any kind, I will bring them. Or if I know I'm the first one on a trail after a snowstorm, I think it's really nice to have them then. But they are heavy, and so you're kind of weighing what will that extra weight do to my pace and my energy expenditure. But then if I'm in deep snow, what will that do to my energy pace and energy expenditure? So I think if there's been any snow at all and you're going on a trail that people generally aren't on, definitely bring them.
All right, and I think this is our last question. If you have a question, ask now, because after this we're going to wrap it up unless somebody gets into Q&A. The question is, can you kind of help, can you go over again the difference between mountain snowshoes, so to speak, and, you know, other snowshoes? There's a question there, I think, on understanding the difference between those more heavy duty ones versus the others.
Yes. So snowshoes, there are two main types. One is called tubular, where there is a metal tube that is the outer ring. And then you have the binding that your foot sits in. And under the toes, you will have teeth that as you step, those teeth under your toes will grip the snow. But around the edge is just a smooth tube. So the only thing biting into the snow is what's under your toe. In mountaineering snowshoes, you still have those bite under the toe, the kind of claws. But then around the edge, you will also have metal teeth around the whole outer edge of your snowshoe that will also bite into the snow. And that can be super important, especially if you are on a slope that's not straight up and down, but maybe has a sideways angle to it. It will give you more points of contact into the snow to give you more security and traction. So on flats, the tubular snowshoes are great, they're fine. But if you're on steep terrain at all, which is a lot of the trails in the White Mountains, you need those extra teeth to give you more purchase into the snow.
All right. I think I'm just double checking here. All right, we have a lot of comments in the question. So a lot of people saying thank you very much. A lot of people think you are very well informed, Lori, and very much enjoyed your presentation. So there's just lots of comments and you know, nice warm fuzzies there for you. Before I turn it over to Lori to close out, I would just like to say on behalf of Bergen, it's wonderful to have you here and do this presentation. For those of you who are still with us or in the Q&A, I would encourage you to reach out to Lori. Like she said, you can follow her on Instagram, Mooney Mountain Guides. We've been privileged to do a lot of things with over our short 15 months of existence here. Speak very highly of Lori, of Alex, and everybody there. They can be a great resource for you as well. So again, thank you, Lori, and I'll just turn it over to you for any final closing remarks.
Thank you all so much for spending your evening with me. I really appreciate it. I hope that this has given you some tools and some strategies to plan some great winter adventures and go out there and enjoy the mountains in a way that keeps your risk level really low. And I'd be happy to help if anyone has any other questions at any time. We live in a beautiful place. We're really lucky. And I want to share my joy of being in the mountains with you all. And so I was really grateful to Rudy and to Bergen for allowing that to happen. So thank you all.
All right, thanks everyone. This will end the webinar. Appreciate it. And again, please follow up with Lori or us. Hopefully we recorded this properly and we'll make it live so you can watch it again. Fingers crossed on the technology there. Have a great evening, everybody. Stay warm this weekend and good luck on your winter hikes.
Thank you.